Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Grace Covenant Chats, brought to you by Grace Covenant Church here in Philadelphia. I am your host, Caleb White, here with my laughing co-host, my blunder, Pastor Doug.
My what? I didn't catch that last word.
Laughing co-host at my blunder.
Your blunder. Oh, no,
yes.
It's funny because you were just mentioning how how do we do this again?
Yeah, I say this every time now because it's like such a long interval.
Yeah.
But yeah, how are you doing, Pastor Doug?
I'm doing well. Excited to talk about this topic.
Yeah, I feel like this is an important topic. It's an important topic, not just because I guess we want more people to come to GCC, right?
Well, it's actually not just about us.
Yeah, but it's like it's such a. And I think kind of like as we just discussed before we started, it's like it's just kind of assumed that everyone coming to college or moving to a new place is going to be looking for churches, right? And we never really talk about how best to look for churches, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. Why are we talking about this topic, Peter?
Yeah, well, I think it's an important topic because, as you mentioned, when people are moving, that's one of the things they got to figure out is like how to choose a good church, right? And so I think there's two reasons why I wanted to talk about this. Firstly, yeah, because in this season now we have a lot of people moving in to Philadelphia. We have new people starting jobs in the city, new grad students, and soon we'll be having new undergrads coming. And so people will be looking for a church. But at the same time, being a transient church, like we have people coming and going since we're sort of in a university context of sorts. We as well are seeing a lot of people leaving Philly to go on to new places. And I want to make sure that they are set up well to be able to find a good church wherever they move to, whether they're moving for a job or a grad school or whatever. So it's kind of two for people who are coming to the city as well as for those who are leaving and looking for new churches.
I see. So why don't we start a little bit more personal, right? How did you choose GCC?
Well,
back in the day, P-Doug.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess like why I chose GCC most recently was because Pastor Young said, "Hey, you want to come here?" That's why I moved down here when Pastor Young invited me to come. But obviously, I was many of you know I was a student here in Philadelphia and came to GCC, way back now. That it was, what year is it? It's 2024, right? So my first time ever going to a GCC event would have been 2006. So I guess 18 years ago.
2006.
But I was a very new believer. I had no idea what it meant to look for a church. And I knew GCC because there was someone my freshman year who lived on my floor who went to GCC. So I was like, oh, well, I guess I should go check that church out. But I had no intention of like looking at other churches really because I didn't know what it meant. But again, I was coming with a complete like a blank slate about what church was. But my very first event for GCC was a Phillies game in the summer. Like there was a GCC Phillies game, going to a baseball game. And the one thing that really stood out to me was how friendly everyone was, because this was my very first event, right? So no one knew who I was, but it felt like because I was new, almost every other person who was at that event came up and like introduced himself to me, right? Because they're like, oh, it's a newcomer, let me introduce myself. And I felt like so welcomed through that, and that really spoke to me. And that was before I even came to a Sunday service. So that by the time I went to my first Sunday service, I was encouraged because like I had already met some people at that event. And then I was also just really blessed by the service in general, because I felt really touched, particularly by the worship. I think it was the worship that really drew me in to GCC. But I remember after my very first service being like, oh, this is the church that I want to be at. So I actually never even looked at other churches. Again, I was a new Christian. I didn't even know what that meant. Like church shopping was not in my vocabulary at all. I just went to there. I really liked it. So, for my mom, like, that's good. Let's just stay here. But again, I think those are two things that really spoke to me, were the friendliness of everyone, the way I felt so welcomed, and then the worship. That really was, is very powerful to me.
Wow. So then what kept you in GCC like after all these years? Or like maybe even AMI, right? As a thought, yeah.
Well, at GCC after that, what kept me was because I made such close relationships. I had my group of brothers that, I met with. We would pray regularly. We were, involved in each other's lives, caring for one another, the wider community. I felt just really supported. I remember I missed a Sunday one time, and all these people were like, asking me like, oh, how are you doing? I didn't see you. I was like, oh, I felt so seen, right? Just missing like one Sunday, and people were asking me like how I was, and because I was actually sick, and so I was like, oh, I was sick, and then people were really caring for me, and that really spoke to me. Like I was actually really seen. My presence was valued, because that was something I never experienced before. Again, I didn't grow up in the church or anything, and so that was just a very like powerful experience for me. So I think the community and the love that was shown to me is what really kept me in it. And then the AMI throughout the years is just because, once eventually I just fell in love with AMI, just really bought into the vision of AMI, and eventually started working at Symphony as a pastor. So, but yeah,
I see. It's interesting. That's like lore, P Doug.
Lore,
2006
This is the
GCC lore.
Yeah. Wait, I just realized you're calling me old.
Yeah, we pull out the GCC like history books for that one. P Doug with an afro.
Oh yes,
those days.
Indeed. How about you, Caleb?
How about me? Yeah, I remember in high school I had a friend who was a year older than me who also came to Penn. And so I remember before I came to Penn, I asked her, I'm like, oh, what are churches to check out? And she's Chinese American, right? So she's like, oh, there's 2 Asian American churches, right? I grew up going to like a primarily Caucasian church, American church. So when I came to GCC, I think for me at least, right, it was like, oh, wow, I feel like known implicitly, right? Like because of like culture or like whatever, right? There was like a sense in which like, oh, I didn't know that I could feel comfortable with a group of people like this, right? But I think even at the beginning, right, GCC was still not like my main source of like community, right? I was more involved in another fellowship at Penn, but my discipler actually encouraged me. He was like, hey, GCC, you can really learn how to worship and pray there, right? And so I think by his encouragement and by getting to know people more individually, I think that opened my heart to being like, yeah, maybe I should invest more time into GCC. And as I started investing more time, and I guess this sort of answers the question too of like, why did I continue with GCC, right? It's like, as I'm starting to see like these relationships like start to grow and like myself grow, right? Via the encouragement of others, via the example of others at GCC, I think that's kind of like what kept me, right, over all these years. Getting more involved, right? Being discipled by Joey Zia really helped,
Wow,
Like,
shout out.
Yeah, shout outs. But, like people at GCC have really impacted and changed my life. And I think like the community aspect, as you said, right? There's people here who struggle with me, right, through faith, through my life, and speak the truth to me when I need to hear it. And so I think, yeah, that's how I chose GCC was kind of like, oh, I just need to choose a church. But why I stayed, perhaps a more profound reason. But yeah, you don't have to go quite so far back into the lore for that one. That's a 2018.
All right, you still want to just hammer on the point that you're a good deal younger than me. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, there's more than a decade's worth of separation, P Doug.
Wow.
But I guess all this begs the question: what should people look for when they're choosing a church? What are good things that I guess you can like see like within like a week, but then like what are things that maybe you need a little bit more time to, right, to be able to discern?
Yeah, that was a good question. And I just want to say up front that, the point of this thing is not to be like GCC propaganda. There's lots of, I just want to preface by there's lots of great churches, other than GCC. And my hope for anyone that's looking for a church is that they would find a church where they can belong and also to grow, whether it be at GCC or another AMI church or any good, Bible believing church. Just want to make sure we preface that, don't want to get too like, GCC. Yeah. Even though obviously I do love GCC and think it is a great church, as Pastor Young used to say, it's not a perfect church, but it's a great church,
Amen.
But there are lots of great churches as well. But I think, when thinking about looking for a church, I think obviously there's the normal things we think about, preaching, the quality of preaching and the quality of the worship. Those are some of the 2 biggest things people think about when they looking at church, because those are like the most upfront things. If you go to a service, what do? You see the worship, you see the preaching. And in fact, I just read a statistic recently that said 80% of people, or 86% of people, I think it was, choose a church based on the quality of the preaching. And obviously that's good. We want to think about the preaching and make sure it's like sound preaching when we go to church. Obviously, first and foremost, we want to make sure the church that we're checking out like actually believe in the Bible, like believe in Jesus, and believe in the gospel, right? Like you want to make sure they're like we're on the same page about the basics of theology and what we know about Jesus. So obviously that's like first and foremost. And so if a church is preaching things that are like not biblical, or preaching things that are just like wild, like, then yeah, maybe that's, again, that should be the first thing that we do. But yeah, when you go to a church, I do think it's important to think about the quality of the preaching, the quality of the worship. But I want to say though that even though things are important, those aren't actually the things that keep you at a church. And I think actually you could see that even through what you and I just spoke about, right?
Right.
You said what kept you at the church was the way that, like, you found people to really like grow with. You had people investing into you. You had people to really struggle with, and all those sorts of things, because that's what keeps you in a church. Like if we only go to church and base it on the preaching, like that's good and all. We want to be like, fed well on Sundays and things like that. But like ultimately though, we need people to surround us with who are going to keep us growing. Right. We haven't got to this point in our study on Hebrews this summer, but let us spur one another on to love and good works. Like that's one of the important points that the author of Hebrews is making towards the end of the letter, right? The author goes through a lot of theology and things like that to ground them, but then what the author is saying towards the end is like, no, but remember that we need to support one another. Let us spur one another on to love and good works. And so we need to make sure that we have others who are going to be walking with us. And so I think when we go to a church, look at like, again, I don't want us to be like judging. Don't be careful from judging, but look at the church and how people interact. Are people really invested in another? Like after service, are people sticking around? Are they talking to one another? Do people know each other? Are like the leaders talking to people? Are the pastor talking to people? Is this a church that seems connected? Because we don't want to be part of a church. You don't want to be a part of a church where you just come on a Sunday and then have no other contact with the church after that. Because as it shows in Acts, like we're called to be like, to meet together throughout, like, like the early church met together in homes, right, throughout the week. And we're called to have sort of this investment into one another. And so I think those are things you want to look at. It's like, how is like the fellowship? How is the community at this church? Because again, that's what's going to keep you for the long run. Preaching and worship may keep you there in the short run, but what will keep you there in the long run and what will really be the basis of how much you grow is the community and the way people are invested into each other. So keep an eye on that. When you go to a church, look at the community, look how people are talking to each other. Do people seem to really care about one another? But again, be careful, because sometimes we can have our own biases when we see that, right? Maybe we don't realize people are talking in different scenarios. Maybe people are just busy on Sundays. Maybe they're meeting together at times, but still we want to be, I think we should learn to start to think about community a little more as part of the equation, and not just like the preaching and worship, even though those are important as well, but those aren't the only variables.
Right. It's like the teaching and the worship can kind of like set the overall like general direction the church is going in, but the community is where that's worked out.
Yeah.
It's like the boots on the ground where the rubber meets the road, right, for your life. I like that thought. But then I think that then necessarily leads to the question of like, how do you church shop? Because like church shopping for a lot of people is like, I go to a different church every week, right? Or maybe like there's a few repeats here and there, but it's hard to get a sense for where the community is in just one Sunday, right? So do you feel like church shopping is a good thing, and how should people best church shop?
Yeah. I think the reality is that it's a necessary evil per se. I don't want to say evil. I mean, it's not terrible, but church shopping is not great because it puts a lot of the emphasis on me. Like, anything, because too much of our world is really self-focused. Like we've become a very consumeristic society, right? We're used to having options so we can choose what we think is best. And so, it's like the church shopping thing feeds into that, but it's also necessary because we live in a reality where there are many different churches in a city, right? We don't live in the times of like the New Testament when there was basically like one church in each city, right? If you were in Corinth, you went to the church in Corinth, right? But they had different like house groups that were part of there, but they would all kind of be together. So we have different churches and we have different denominations and all that. So that's why I said it's like a sort of a necessary evil. But I don't want to say it's evil because again, we sort of have to go through it. But again, we have to be careful that we don't always put the focus on me. Like, what do I like in a church, right? Because then we don't always want to just surround ourselves with people who think like us. Because our world is so fragmented now. We live in so many echo chambers because of the way that we can choose so much of our lives. We curate our lives so much because we have the ability to, right? Customization is like
Right.
the highest ideal in any scenario, right? Customize who you talk to, customize what you read, what you see, and all that. So we want to be careful not to allow our church shopping to be fed by that same mindset, because when we're surrounded by people who all think like us, it's easy then to be kind of stuck in the same place. But so church shopping is, I think, necessary because we want to make sure we are going to a good church where we think we can grow. So, but I want to say that like when you are church shopping, don't just base it on the Sunday message. Check out like the small group, or check out the prayer meeting. Check out the other events, because I think that will show a little bit more about what the church is when you see the other events. Like I said, actually, what really spoke to me was like just going to a Phillies game, because just seeing the way that people talked to me and met me on like just this like casual event, it really spoke to me. So try out some of the other events. Go to a small group, things like that, because that's where you'll see. That's where you can really meet the community in a more real way. So don't just base it on the Sundays. And the reality is, actually, nowadays we can get a Sunday experience through YouTube. You can get a sense of the preaching and the worship. So it's very easy to like understand that part of the church. So when we visit a church, because we can already have access to the worship and the preaching, we should look at some of the other variables a little more closely when we're actually there, like in person for the first time. Which it's kind of a weird thing. I realize that nowadays that people often will watch a message or watch a service online before they check it out, and it's easy to have like a reaction. Oh, that's not good. But like I realized actually there's some pro to that, because that way you can actually when you come in person, you can then look at the church outside of those things, because you already been exposed to preaching and worship, and now you can look at like the community and things like that. But again, just going back to my main point was that I think it's important to look at the church not just through the lens of Sunday service, but through the other things, whether it be a small group, a prayer meeting, a fellowship event, because I think that's where you can get a better sense of the community. And again, community is what will keep you in the church for the long run.
I see. Yeah, I like that thought. I think then like my next question almost maybe gets a little bit like more like, I don't want to say philosophical, because like it's not real, but like it's almost like, where do you see the intersection between like, where is God calling me versus like, how do I discern, right?
Yeah.
Like what's wise for me right now? Yeah.
But thank you for bringing back to the more spiritual side. That's, I do all this that you do when looking for a church shopping, all that should be done from a posture of humility and prayer. Not that God will always be like speaking to our heart, go to that church or that church, right? Like we can't expect God to be as like prescriptive of that, though maybe he will, like maybe there will be a specific calling, like God can speak in that sort of way. But I think we want to have that posture of humility and that posture of just like prayer before the Lord, and say, yeah, God, like I want to submit this decision to you and allow you to have the final say over it, right? We shouldn't only be making this decision based on like what seems right in our own eyes. Because the Lord knows more. Maybe what we see is not the reality, because our perspective is limited, but God's perspective is greater. And so there's something that maybe he knows about the church that maybe he wants us to be at that we didn't see. And so we should be, really just try to really be prayerful and humble about the decision, and just allow like God to even soften our hearts. But on the same token, sometimes when we over spiritualize things, it leads to indecision. And so I want to caution about that.
Right.
Because I've seen some people get paralyzed because they're like, I'm waiting for God to like really give me the clear sign of what church he wants to be at. And I think we don't want to church shop for too long. Like if you're church hopping and all that, I would say like do it for maybe like a month, 2 at most, because the more you church hop, the less that you're going to be able to get plugged in, and the less then accountability and all that that you'll have. And in fact, like if you're going in one of those periods of time when there's like waves of people coming, but then you join, but because you church hop, you didn't get to know maybe like the new wave of people at church. There's actually, you have missed out then on like sort of the cohort of sorts, right? Because sometimes people like have a cohort of sorts because they're like new to the church, and that's nice to be able to be a part of that, particularly for like say freshmen coming in, right? If you waited so long that you didn't get to know other freshmen, like that can kind of be sad. Though obviously there's always hope. You always get connected, and I wouldn't want a church to be like cliquey, like we're not going to let you into our group because you came late. But still, there's something we can miss out if we wait too long on hopping. So I would say like try to limit it from like 1 to 2 months at most.
Yeah, I like that. I like that boundary. Maybe even a thought that crosses my mind is like, especially since you're like in a new city or like a new environment and you're looking for a new church, you are missing a lot of like the, discipleship, mentorship aspects, right? That you would have, right, in making a life decision
Mm-hmm.
if you were already plugged into a church. So it's like maybe a thought is like keep the people who were in your old church like involved, right, in the
Yeah.
process, so then they can also
Yeah.
like hold you accountable, right, and provide some insight on where you need to go. Yeah.
No, for sure. Yeah. Like, because a lot of times, people other church might know other churches that might be similar to the church that you're
Right.
coming from, and so I get that question a lot. Like, someone's moving into such and such city, they're like, "Oh, is there another church like GCC in that city?" And I love to do that. Someone asked me that, and there's a city that I had no idea, but I just love that question. I was just doing all this research. Like, I probably spent like an hour just like looking at churches for that person, just because I just enjoy that. So yeah, I think that's a great point, Caleb.
Yeah. Thanks, P Doug. I'll give you one more question, and this is just so that this isn't just an episode for new people, right? But like for us as a church community that's already here, right? How should we approach this season, right? I think in sorts, and I think I'll phrase that kind of vaguely, because I think like there's a sense is like there's a lot of newness, there's a lot of excitement, but then there's also a sense in which like I don't know if I really want to invest in this person because they might not be here next week, or like they might not ever come back, right? I might not ever see them again. So it's like it feels like a bit of a mixed bag.
Yeah.
So yeah, how should we as a standing community here, right, at our church approach this season?
Yeah. Well, what I like to say is that everyone, if you're a part of this church, everyone is the welcoming team, particularly during this season. I mean, that should be the case all year, but particularly during this season, everyone is the welcoming team. Everyone is a greeter and all that. And so my encouragement is, hey, like when there's new people, you don't have to have a long conversation, right? We don't have to, some people get afraid that they aren't like a conversationalist. They aren't a social butterfly. So how can I have a conversation with new people? But you just go say hello. That makes a huge difference. Even just say hello. My name is such and such, right? As someone who like came to GCC from like the outside from before, just having people introduce themselves just spoke so much to me, even if we didn't have a conversation after that, right? Because then I felt like this is another face that I recognize. And having faces that you recognize makes a big difference for people who are new. So don't feel like you have to have like a great conversation. Just introduce yourself, just say hi. And then maybe you can say, hey, like, what do you do? What are you studying? Why are you here? And then if you see anything common, you can be like, oh, let me introduce you to someone that's like that. And then you pass them off, right? Even if
Right.
That's what I like to say to, like, when I used to lead welcoming, that's what I used to say. Is like, don't feel like you have to talk to everyone, but maybe someone else that person could talk to because maybe some commonality, right? You're talking to someone and they like sports. So, let me introduce this person, or they like anime. Let's just introduce them to Caleb. Like,
Yeah. I like that thought, because like I think some of the or I feel like one of the thoughts that I've heard and certainly felt for myself too is like, I feel like I'm asking the same questions over and over again, and like I'm having the same like small talk over and over again. But then I feel like if we shift that mindset to like, oh no, I'm actually digging for meaningful connections, right? I'm having small talk so I can find a meaningful connection for this person, right? I think that really has made a lot of difference for even me, right?
For sure, yeah.
Yeah.
And
So-
even if you're not the meaningful connection, but if you can know someone that could have that meaningful connection, that makes it,
Yeah. Anyways, that was a fun conversation. Doug.
it was.
Yeah. Thanks for your thoughts.
Yeah,
I
of
think,
course.
I hope they'll be helpful for a lot of people, and I
Yeah.
think they will be, right? Because this does feel like definitely one of those topics that we don't talk enough about. Which feels strange because everyone has to do it in today's day and age, right? Or deal with it. But yeah.
So I'm gonna close off by saying, anyone that's looking for a new church, I hope that you find a great church, wherever you go. Don't push off that decision. Just find a church, grow, because there are a lot of great churches, a lot of places you can grow. And the more you put it off, actually, the more that you are hindering that possibility of growth. So I just want to close with that.
Right. So if you want to check out GCC, you can do so on our Instagram with at GCC Philadelphia. Link is down in the description, or you can check us out at GraceCovenant.net.
Philly.gracecovenant.net.
Sorry, Philly.gracecovenant.net. That was the old link. Oh, my bad. It's been too long.
And he called me old. You're the one living in the past here.
You know what? Maybe it's because my brain is on so much new content, Peter. I gotta keep up with
My fault.
the trends. Yeah. But thank you so much for spending some time with us today. We hope you are that the Lord leads you, right? There we go, to church where you will grow at, and we will see you next time.